The most notorious and shocking king to ever rule over England was Henry VIII, and throughout his reign on the throne, 70,000 people were executed all across England. The Tower of London during his reign became a place where queens were executed and where the infamous torture devices such as a rack and the scavenger's daughter were brutally used against those who were imprisoned. Henry sent 2 of his own wives to be executed at the Tower, but there was a forgotten woman of the Tower who was condemned during his reign, and she was the mother of the king's great enemy, Reginald Pole. However, her execution was performed by a terrible executioner who made a real mess of things with his axe. Join us today as we look at the most ruthless execution of Henry VIII's reign, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Margaret Pole was the daughter of George Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence, who was a bit of a traitor during the Wars of the Roses. He crossed his own brother Edward IV a number of times, and he was also the brother of Richard III. Margaret's mother was a daughter of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, also known as Warwick Kingmaker. She did have royal blood, and because of this she was seen as dangerous by the Tudors, who could be the enemies of her family during the Wars of the Roses. Her childhood was dominated by the civil wars, and her uncle even ordered the execution of her father, and her father would lose his life inside the Tower of London, being drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine. However, when Henry VII came onto the throne and the Tudor dynasty began, he married Margaret's cousin Elizabeth of York, and Margaret was looked after by the new king and queen. In winter 1487 she was married to Henry VII's cousin Sir Richard Pole, and she became close with Catherine of Aragon, who had come over to England to marry Henry VII's eldest son Arthur. Margaret was left a widow in 1505 with 5 children, and she was forced to live inside of Sion Abbey and rely on the help of the nuns there. However, when Henry VIII came onto the throne, she came back to court. Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon himself, the wife of his deceased brother Arthur, and Margaret was a lady-in-waiting to Catherine, and Parliament also awarded her a significant amount of her brother's lands, and she became known as the Countess of Salisbury. Margaret was a strong woman who managed her lands well, and her sons also did very well, and they became significant members of the court and the royal household. But Margaret did lock horns with the king over her land and how best to manage it, but she was close to the monarchy, and she was even the governess of Henry VIII's oldest daughter Mary, who would later be known as Bloody Mary I when she came onto the throne. She stayed loyal to Mary and Catherine when the king tried to get rid of them in favour of Anne Boleyn, but Margaret's son was a real powerhouse against Henry VIII, who would dissent against the English king a lot. Reginald Pole was considered for being a cardinal, but he became a huge enemy of the English king. He spoke with a number of possible enemies to try and invoke an invasion of England. However, Margaret Pole then began to attract suspicion in the royal circles, and Margaret also refused to give Princess Mary's jewels back when she had been declared illegitimate and her household had been broken up. All this added to further upset and anger, and the king then said if the Cardinal's hat was ever sent to England for Margaret's son, then he would not have a head to place a hat on top of. But Reginald continued to speak out against the king, and Henry VIII was now focused on wreaking havoc with the Pole family, who let's remember had royal blood and could be considered a threat to his throne. Reginald Pole was made a cardinal in 1537, and he took part in organising the Pilgrimage of Grace, a huge northern uprising against the king and his changes to the church. This was the most serious rebellion Henry VIII faced during his reign, and the pilgrimage focused on the anger about the dissolutions of the monasteries, which left many monks homeless and penniless. It was cruel to the pious men and the women of God, and a number of abbots and senior figures in monasteries and convents across England were even hanged, drawn and quartered, being suspended from their own abbeys. But Margaret Pole and Geoffrey Pole, another of Margaret's sons, were implicated in the organisation of the rebellion, and Geoffrey was arrested in 1538. But then at the age of 65, Margaret Pole herself was arrested and was sent to the Tower of London. She was accused of the incredibly serious charge of treason, and she lost all of her titles and lands, and an investigation turned out false evidence against her. Cromwell claimed he found a tunic in her home, allegedly showing the 5 wounds of Christ, and Pole was linked to the underground Catholic worship and was accused of being a Catholic rebel. This was found allegedly 6 months after her home had been thoroughly searched, and it's believed that this was nonsense. However, it was a way that Cromwell and Henry VIII could sentence Margaret Pole, who was by the standards of the day a very elderly woman, to death. Margaret Pole was left inside of the Tower of London after being accused for 2.5 years, and every day she would wake up and wonder if this day would be her last. She knew the brutality of her king, and she knew what would happen to her. Inside of the tower she was allowed a number of servants and grants of clothing. However, from the prison cell she wrote, "For traitors on the block should die, I'm no traitor, no not I. My faithfulness stands fast, and so towards a block I shall not go, nor make one step, as you shall see. Christ, in thy mercy save thou me." She was a desperate woman, and she was suffering from her prolonged imprisonment inside of the dark and damp tower. On the morning of the 27th of May 1541, Margaret Pole was told that within the next hour she would be executed, and she was informed that the executioner was readying himself to end her life. She claimed that she had not committed any crimes, and therefore she was guilty of nothing, but the king had ordered her execution. It was a killing which was hastily arranged, and there was no scaffold and limited preparation time for the execution. There was simply just a wooden block placed on the cobbled pavements of the Tower of London, waiting for Margaret Pole, along with an executioner who was armed with his axe. As she was a woman of royal blood, she was given a private execution within the walls of the Tower of London, and was not given the public spectacle which would have occurred on Tower Hill. There are differing accounts of her execution. At the age of 67, she went to her death not knowing what she was accused of and guilty of. The main executioner of London was sent north to deal with the rebels in the wake of the Pilgrimage of Grace, and because of this, the man brought in to perform Margaret Pole's execution was very inexperienced. A report states how a wretched and blundering youth literally hacked her head and shoulders to pieces in the most pitiful manner. This account also states how it took around 10 brutal swings of the axe to perform her execution and take her head from her body. Another account states how after the first blow from the axe, Margaret jumped up and managed to escape from the block, and she then began to attempt to flee the executioner and was chased by him around the courtyard where the execution then took place. This then says that 11 swings of the axe were needed to behead her. But the similarity in these accounts are that Margaret Pole died an incredibly brutal death, and let's remember that she was an elderly woman when this happened. Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, was one of the forgotten victims of the Tower of London during the reign of King Henry VIII, and her execution was one which made the Tower a formidable and incredibly feared place of suffering. She was imprisoned for a number of years, but her execution ordeal was horrific and shocking. The first blow of the axe that struck her shoulders would have been excruciating, but if Margaret Pole did spring herself from the block following this, it's crazy to believe that this could have happened. But today she is considered a saint. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And once again, thank you so much for watching.